So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Dharma Gathering. My name is Ashley Dinges, and I'm one of the co-founders of the weekly Dharma Gathering. And it's always a pleasure to be here with you live, and hello to those who are watching the recording as well. Tonight's session will be led by Caverly Morgan, and the title of tonight's talk is "The Absolute is the Relative, Touching Race, Injustice, and Love." So we'll be beginning with a guided meditation, and we'll move into a talk, Q&A, and have some time for discussion as well. Please note that, as you can tell, tonight's session is being recorded. So if you prefer not to be seen, you can just turn off your camera feature. And you will also be recorded if you ask a question. So if you would like to submit a question without being recorded, you can just use the chat box, and you're also welcome to engage with all of us using the chat box and that function throughout tonight's talk. The recording of tonight's gathering will be available within 48 hours via your Purchase Products tab in your Vimeo account, and you'll also receive an email notification once this is posted as well. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce our teacher for this evening. Caverly Morgan is a meditation teacher, nonprofit leader, and visionary. She's the founder and guiding teacher of the Presence Collective, which is dedicated to igniting personal transformation and collective awakening. She's also the founder and guiding teacher of Peace in Schools, a nonprofit which created the nation's first 4-credit mindfulness class in public high schools. Peace in Schools is pioneering new depths in mindfulness education through teaching youth as well as training educators. Caverly blends the original spirit of Zen with a modern non-dual approach. Her practice began in 1995 and has included 8 years of training in a silent Zen monastery. She's been teaching contemplative practice since 2001, and prior to her efforts with Peace in Schools, she formerly worked for nonprofits serving various people, serving people with special needs. An artist and educator, she brings insight, passion, warmth, and humor to her transformative work with students of all ages and experience levels. She leads meditation retreats, workshops, and online classes internationally, and has been a teacher and presenter at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, 1440 Multiversity, Worldwide Insight, Esalen, the Mind and Life International Symposium for Contemplative Research, Buddha at the Gas Pump, Open Circle, the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, and many more. She speaks publicly at conferences on topics including contemplative practice, social entrepreneurship, authentic leadership, and mindfulness education, and has been featured in publications including Mindful Magazine and the New York Times. She is dedicated to actualizing possibility, serving love, and embodying the truth of interconnection. Caverly lives in Portland with her husband Vineet and their 2 dogs. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Caverly, and please teach us.
Ashley, thank you so much. I really appreciate that very, very much. And next time I'll definitely check in with Alyssa, my assistant, and have her send a shorter bio. It was a mouthful, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm very glad to be here. My greatest passion these days is the evolution of Presence Collective. So you can find out more about that on my website if that interests you. But Shantae is part of that, and I know she's a huge reason this exists as well. That they are a huge reason this exists as well. And I'm really, excuse me for that, I'm really just grateful. I'm grateful for how practice is evolving. Specifically, in my case, I trained, as you heard, monastically in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And in the monastery where I trained, there was a lot of emphasis on what gets in the way of our realizing our inherent liberation, specifically what gets in the way on the level of personal conditioning. So I've become incredibly enlivened by the conversation around what gets in the way in terms of our collective conditioning. So with that, I'm going to start a guided meditation. I invite you to softly gaze downward at a 45-degree angle. Or you might want to close the eye. Now, in this meditation, it is often the case that you, during meditation, direct the attention outward to various objects. For example, you might direct your attention outward to the breath. And we think of the breath as inward in a lot of ways. But by directing outward, what I mean is the attention, which arises out of awareness, landing on an object, albeit maybe even a subtle object, like the subtle object of the breath or a subtle object of sensation or sound. So for this meditation, rather than the attention moving outward, I'm going to invite you to allow the attention to rest back in awareness itself, in its source. I really love this word sinking. Our attention is moving outward from object to object to object so regularly. And in this meditation, we're inviting a sinking of the attention. You might like the image of a flashlight. And if the attention is like the light moving outward and landing on X, Y, or Z, in this meditation, just allowing that light to draw back into the flashlight itself, to rest there, to sink back into, again, its source. Our entire call today, our entire time together, arises out of a very particular premise. And this premise is that what we most long for is inherent. To make it extraordinarily simple, we could say that what we most long for is happiness, peace. I'm suggesting in this moment that happiness, that peace is our true nature. Fundamental, inherent unchanging, that which can be relied upon. So allow the attention to sink and rest there. Notice that this awareness where we rest the attention is much like the space of the room that you're in. The space of the room that you're in is not disturbed by someone entering or leaving that space. We were having technical difficulties right before this call. The space of awareness is not tarnished by those technical difficulties. It's not tarnished by the activities of the mind. It's not disturbed or agitated by the agitation of the conditioned mind. So simply allow the attention to rest there. You might like the image of a tea bag seeping in hot water. The attention resting in awareness. The attention being infused with itself, in a sense, with its source, with its own source. How would we have attention without awareness? How would we know our own attention without awareness? Where else could attention exist other than within this open, vast field of infinite awareness? Because what we all share is this longing for happiness, we're often conditioned to have the attention arise out of this open, vast field of awareness. Not that it leaves awareness, but arise from its source, I should say, to seek after various objects, which we believe will bring us the happiness or the peace we long for. In this meditation, we're just releasing that struggle, that pattern, that habit. in the name of directly experiencing what is most primary, most fundamental awareness itself. If you are present to the attention moving up out of this resting place, if you will, you can practice non-judgment about that activity, this habit to seek, to look outward. It can be easy to confuse the word practice with a type of efforting. I need to try to discipline the mind or try to focus the attention. Nothing wrong with that. But in this meditation, we're actually softening that habit. Why? Because what we most long for is actually inherent and fundamental. So think of it like a clenched fist. It can seem like it might take effort to release the fist, but it's actually the ceasing of the efforting of gripping that allows for the opening. So in this moment, just allow the attention to be like that. You're ceasing the habit of the attention moving outward from thing to thing to thing. And you're allowing it to rest, to be. If the mind is busy, just allow the mind to be busy. Again, noticing that this open, infinite space of awareness is not disturbed by the activity of the mind. And for one more full minute, allowing the attention to rest. All right, thank you so much. So I thought I would begin, we've begun, of course, but begin this next section of our time together by reading what I submitted as the topic, but with a little bit of background information. And then I will say that I feel most engaged when others are willing to share with me their experience. I had the opportunity, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Shante in person yet, but for the first time yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak with them on the phone. And one thing that I was talking about is that it was arising for me that it might be, I was leaning towards renaming the conversation today, the colonization of oneness. And then we were talking a little bit about that, and I realized that it's actually perfectly woven in with the theme that I already had submitted. So again, I want to read a little bit more with us, then hopefully engaging a little bit with each other. What interests me the most is the dialogue around it. And I'll preface this by saying the term colonization of oneness came up because I was mentioning to Shante that I had just done a presentation. I was part of a panel on social justice and teachings at the Science and Non-Duality Conference. And a circumstance arose in which I was very present to the veneer of oneness, the languaging of oneness without the embodiment of oneness as an experience. So I'll say more about that as we go through these notes. So when we engage, again, the topic is the absolute is the relative, touching race and justice and love. When we engage in the distortion that the relative plane, and by relative plane, I really mean the everyday, mundane. It's a relative plane issue that before this call started, I was having trouble with the internet. And it's a relative plane issue that I realized during the call that I was thirsty, and I fortunately have water here. There's, I'm speaking about the plane that, the plane of reality in which injustices arise. When we're engaged in the distortion that the relative plane is separate from the absolute, just to spell out, just so we're all on the same page, By absolute in this context, I'm referring to that infinite awareness that I pointed to in the meditation. So yes, we all have this, we all are the same awareness, this vast, open, and infinite true nature is our shared being. It doesn't belong to any one person. It's not tarnished by anything. It's not affected by the relative plane. So when we engage that the relative is separate from the absolute, that the relative is something to just transcend, or that it's just an illusion. You heard I trained monastically in the Zen tradition. Saying that things are just an illusion is a popular way to talk about things. We ignore the reality of the illusion. By reality of the illusion, what I mean is many people think of, oh, that's just an illusion, as a way to invalidate something, or they think of that's just an illusion as a way of saying it's not real. But there is a reality to all illusion. There's a reality to a dream. Yes, it may be a dream at night, but there's a reality to it. You had that dream arose in the open vast field of consciousness. I like to think of the word ignorance. The root of ignorance is the ignoring of. I think it was Huang Po a long time ago that spoke about the importance of not, when speaking about illusion, not ignoring the reality of the illusion. And the reality of the illusion is pure awareness or pure consciousness. So, for example, we just say, oh, it's an illusion, and we write it off. But we forget to say, well, what is the reality of that illusion? The reality of that illusion is that it's too arising in the same open, vast field of awareness or consciousness. And then how is that illusion known? We know it through awareness. And by whom? Only awareness is aware of that illusion. We like to think that it's a separate self or the ego. But that feeds the distortion that there is an I that's quote unquote doing practice. So the relative may appear to arise out of the absolute being the open vast field of consciousness, as waves appear to arise out of the ocean, but like waves, both relative and absolute are components of a greater whole. They're not separate. So when we know ourselves as this whole, which subsumes everything, we cease to diminish or dismiss the mystery of being human, of being embodied, of living on the relative plane. And we experience viscerally that the world is my family. From this understanding, we recognize that liberation is not a singular experience. So this is important. There is no individual ego that wakes up. Consciousness itself is that which is awake. As we do the kind of practice, and it's really, in a way, a non-practice of resting the attention back in awareness, the veil that keeps this illusion that we are separate from life, that veil can be lifted so that we can, and in that we experience ourselves as awareness very directly. So we suffer when we forget that there can be no individual ego that experiences enlightenment. We suffer when we perceive ourselves as separate from the collective on the level of consciousness. So I'm going to suffer if I perceive myself as separate from this open, vast, infinite consciousness. And I'm also going to suffer if I perceive myself as separate on this relative plane. Oh, that neighbor isn't like me, so I'm other than them. We're separate. When we recognize that the world is arising in us, awareness, there's nothing to dismiss. So how then, in our situation of privilege on the relative plane, whatever situation that may be for us, do we dismiss injustice, bias, cruelty in the name of transcendence or spiritual understanding? This is where this colonization of oneness theme ties directly in. How do we participate in systems of oppression while ignoring the effects on our neighbor as well as the whole? And do we fall for the story that the awakened life we seek is mine to have rather than ours to be? And within that, what's love got to do with it? That's just to get us into conversation, I hope. There's a lot in that meditation as well as in this write-up for us to chat about. So I'm hoping with Ashley's support that we might have someone who wishes to come on to the call and engage in discussion, or if you'd like to type any comments or impressions or thoughts that are arising in the sidebar, that'd be great too.
I would start by asking a question, if that's okay.
Yes. Please, Ashley, thank you.
Yeah, I often think about this in, I come from the Shambhala tradition, and a lot of, as does Shantae and some of our other co-founders who work on this platform, and something that we really, something that we talk about a lot is enlightened societies. So we use that word often in the way that we talk about our practice and how we manifest in the world. And so for me, I think that as I've been like starting to work with identity and privilege, and at least trying to open up into some kind of active contemplation around it on a relative level, that one thing that's been helpful for me is really thinking about when I'm in a room, or when I'm in a talk, or when I'm in a class, or when I'm practicing, looking around and kind of saying, not only just, who's here in this room, but who's not here in this room, and why aren't they here? What are we building if what we're building isn't necessarily inclusive to everyone, and why is that? And so that for me has been, because I feel like these things, especially when you feel that you're coming from a place of just acknowledging privilege, it's hard to kind of take a first step in, and it feels kind of very overwhelming in terms of well, what can I do? And that was, for me, that was one thing that was just like, okay, well, I'm noticing that maybe I'm the only younger person, or maybe we're all in the same income bracket, and maybe what reasons why is it that there's only so many of us represented here, and what kind of ways do I contribute to building that? And so I think what you were saying resonated with, that's been a long-term contemplation for me, and just I know that that's not specific to our particular Dharma community, and that is also something that a lot of other people think about in other traditions and communities too. But I just wanted to say that I felt like what you were saying just reminded me of that contemplation for myself. And I wonder if you have any, because when we talk about, I always sort of associate the relative level with action or activity or accomplishing. And so, yeah, I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. First, Ashley, I just want to reflect back to you that because I'm not from the Shambhala tradition, I wasn't familiar with this phrase, enlightened society. I mean, as you say it, I have a vision of what enlightened society would look like, and it's definitely not what we have right now. So I like that phrase. It sounds like it's offered as an aspiration. Like if we were tell me if I'm right about this, but is it like a way of saying, hold that in your heart. And because if we were an enlightened society, we wouldn't be caught in this habit of othering, and we would be walking into spaces and recognizing, like, is the space welcoming for everybody? Is the space welcoming for somebody who's not able-bodied? Is the space welcoming for somebody who's not white? Is the space welcoming for someone who's younger, older? Is that kind of the way, is enlightened society a way to point to something we can aspire to and then measure up kind of where we are in relationship with it?
I would say yes, and also it's taking it beyond just the Dharma community as well too. So it's like, it's essentially sort of like, how are you realizing your practice in life, and what are you doing to kind of bring your practice forward into all aspects of your life at a relative level. And so for me, when I think about that, and when I'm thinking about it in terms of our practice containers, and then I look around and see that, okay, well, a lot of us here are white, or a lot of us here are upper middle class New Yorkers. I mean, I live in New York, but you could replace that with any kind of different descriptors, but it's often, we often look and sound alike. So that to me is just interesting, because it's like we talk a lot about what we're doing outside of our practice, or how we're bringing our practice into our lives, but then a lot of our spaces feel, and not just, again, it's not just particular to my tradition, I've experienced this in other practice settings, but yeah, so that I would say that's accurate.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is incredibly important, because the piece that I'm really resonating with the most is, you know, we need to acknowledge that the relative plane is where the suffering is happening. The suffering is not happening on the level of the absolute. But what's being lost if we say, oh, okay, so we're all just going to kind of go to the absolute. We're going to just go to this place of, like, you know, oneness, and then use it almost as like a kind of a path, like oh, okay, since we're all one, we don't need to pay attention to whether this space is welcoming, or whether the actions that the things that I'm participating on the relative plane are causing harm, because, you know, on this fundamental level, we're all one. Meanwhile, I might go back to my, I don't live in a gated community, but like, I could say, oh, we're all one, and then go back to my, like, white gated community. So there's such, I think, a lack of attunement and alignment with what we experience and know to be true, and then how we act on the relative plane. I do like to trust that anyone who's going to say we are one is tapping into something that we all do fundamentally know. I like to trust that we, on a really deep level, we feel our interconnection. We actually know, I think, on a deep level. We have to turn something off if we're watching the news, or we see some being or animal harmed. Like, we have to shut something off in order to not be deeply affected like that, or by that, because we have a shared being. So that's why I've been so interested in any place that we have. I think it's just a habit. And it's a habit that's born of a system of ignorance that has us separating out the absolute and the relative, rather than recognizing, because we all have this same shared being, that's all the more reason for us to be able to move through the world honoring that shared being. And as you point to, then we're paying close attention to what's happening on the relative plane. How are my actions affecting others? Not from a, well, I better fix that because I want to take care of my own karmic responsibility, but again, from this this recognition. Like, it's not just about me and my suffering and ending my suffering and resolving my karma and enlightenment for me. It's the recognition that our being is shared. Mm-hmm.
And I think also too, you said this before I asked my question, or before I said that. But for me, a really active thing is like, not necessarily, I think it's easy to sometimes identify when you're doing something harmful, but something that has been really active for me is like, where am I ignorant to how I'm participating? And
Yeah.
that's a much more difficult contemplation for me personally, because um, I've just realized, very simple ways that I've contributed to those structures, and building walls. And
Yeah. It can be really powerful when we embrace the recognition that it's out of the love of our shared being that we want to live in a way that our actions are in alignment with that truth, versus, oh my gosh, I'm a bad person if I'm causing harm, and I have these blind spots, and so now I need to live with this type of like fear that I don't know what my blind spots are, and I have to try to get rid of them. We can have a passion for releasing the blinders out of the recognition, out of our love for truth, basically. And I think that changes the game for us. I think that, depending on our relationship with truth, we will find more joy in the process. Yeah. I see that we have a question on the side. Oh, you just asked, can we read it out loud? Okay. Yes, if we have permission. Oh, great. I would love to. Would you like to read that then, Ashley? And I'll receive
Sure.
it and respond.
Sure, I can read this. So for those watching on the recording, we received a question in the chat box, and because you can't see it, I will read it for you. So this question is from Alex. Thank you, Caverly. I'm not in a situation where I can talk or be on video, so I am grateful for the chat box. I appreciate the way that you talk about the inseparable nature of the absolute and relative. I know that this trap of this is not real, therefore it doesn't matter, is an easy one to fall into. It makes me wonder, what is the point or benefit of the absolute plane at all? If suffering happens on the relative plane and we need to engage on that level, what is the benefit or point of having the absolute, especially when it can lead to spiritual bypassing, etc.?
Alex, I think your question is a really, really important one, and I'm very grateful that you wrote it in. To me, asking what is the benefit or the point of the absolute is a little bit like asking, what is the benefit or point to I'm trying to think of a really good analogy. The one that arises for the first one there, I'll just start saying the first one that arose for me. The first one that arose for me is like, what is the benefit or point of oxygen? So what I want to suggest is that this relative plane that we're talking about today, it only arises, it can't arise anywhere else but this pure field, open, infinite field of consciousness. Where else could this whole relative experience exist? Your question is such a brilliant one, and it reveals that to your conditioned mind, these things actually really are separate. It's like, well, the relative plane is over here and the absolute is over here. And so what's the point in engaging with this? But this can only exist, this relative plane can only exist because of the absolute. It's like saying, where else could, I'm going to go back to that image of the empty space. I'm not sure if you were here for the meditation. No worries if you weren't. I used this image of an open room. So the space of, for example, the room I'm in is not actually affected by me putting flowers from the backyard in it today. But where else could flowers from the backyard arise except for in open space? What I'm doing in this call is pointing out that it can be dangerous to forget that these flowers can only exist inside this open space, because if we think that there's only the relative, it's like it would be easy for us to forget that we do have this shared being. It would be easy to forget that shared being is consciousness itself. It's awareness itself. So I'm suggesting that the nature of these flowers is actually infinite consciousness, and I'm suggesting that your true nature, Alex, is infinite consciousness, and that Ashley's is infinite consciousness, and that mine is too. That is what, if you will, binds us. That is, if you will, what makes us not separate objects. So it's actually the only way we could see these things as separate is if we hold the notion, or I should say, the only way that let me reframe that one more time. The way we suffer is that we see these things as separate. So if I'm only looking at things on the relative plane, in my experience, that's how an experience of othering arises in the first place. Othering happens because we're only looking at the relative plane, and this object is over here and this object is over here. Or here's this thing I like and here's this thing I don't like. And we're seeing things in terms of what's separate. I want to suggest that working on the relative plane is profoundly impacted when we work on the relative plane while recognizing our shared being. In a sense, I'm saying while recognizing our oneness. But that's not the same thing as, oh, since we're all one, these other things don't matter. In a way, I'm saying because we're one, all these things matter. Because we're one, it does, if I'm paying attention, it does hurt my heart if someone else experiences pain, because we have the same, again, we have the same shared being. Yeah, so the thing I appreciate about your question is it reveals that place that we get stuck when we see these as separate, rather than recognizing that they actually can't be teased apart. In the same way that a wave can't be taken out of the ocean. Maybe that's a better analogy, Alex. How are you going to take a wave out of the ocean? But when we walk around acting like waves can be taken out of the ocean and dealing with them as if they're just separate objects, we get into the business of othering instead of moving through the world from the recognition of belonging. When Ashley pointed out walking into a room and noticing, like, okay, who's not here? That question itself arises from deep care and some felt sense of belonging. Like, we all belong to each other. We are made of the same consciousness. We are made of the same thing. So I care if our society is acting in ways that are breaches in the recognition of that shared being. That affects me, the whole. It affects we. So Alex, I don't know if you feel up for typing any. I hear that you can't come on screen, but I don't know if you want to type any response to that, but no worries if you don't. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's a very, very rich question. And like I said, the question itself reveals a deep habit we all have. We all have this habit to see these things as separate. So Alex says, yeah, I appreciate that. So then if we want to engage in helping people in the relative plane, how are ways in which this view of waves in oceans and infinite consciousness, how do they help us to do that without othering? Thank you. I'm suggesting there's there's a non-dual teacher who, his name is Rupert Spira, and he said, in order to know our humanity, we have to first know our divinity. One of the things I like about that quote is it suggests that, again, if I'm moving through the world knowing that my being is the same being as Alex's, then my movement in the world is informed by my understanding that we're connected. That changes the way that my actions manifest in the world. So for example, I don't know if you know much about the Enneagram, Alex, but I'm a 1 on the Enneagram. And that means that I'm, in terms of my personality type, I'm wired to be a perfectionist. I can really dive into that world of right and wrong. And I can definitely, in my own conditioning, I can feel a deep tendency at times to become righteous, to feel like, well, this is the right answer. And I live in Portland, Oregon, so I can feel the energy of, out here we talk, I don't know if this is like a big term, but in my community out here, we'll talk about like the woke Olympics, so, this kind of contest for who's most woke. And it can feel incredibly, like when those kinds of conversations are happening, and we take our attention off our shared being, it's just another manifestation, in my experience, of right, wrong, good, bad, a very dualistic lens where only one side, quote unquote, if you will, wins. It's about winning versus losing. It just maintains othering. But when I'm really grounded in the truth of what I was pointing to in the meditation, when I'm grounded in the recognition that we are the same being, then in my experience, my actions in the world are much more infused with love. It's not because I've been practicing loving kindness, it's because I see you in me and me in you. And when we're recognizing that that is our nature, our care, in my experience, can be more reflective of truth rather than just another tendency to fall into the story of right and wrong and somebody winning on the relative plane, which, if we look to our history, never leads to peace. It's not that great movement doesn't, on the relative plane, there could be important movement that happens, but our experience, if you look at it closely, is that if at the heart of our actions is the belief in separation, the only result that can come out of it is going to be another version or form of separation. And if our actions are reflections of our recognition of our shared being, in my experience, they have a different kind of power. And that's one of the reasons here in Portland, we're hosting my dear friend, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, next weekend. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the work of Radical Dharma is because it's so grounded in love, in Dharma. It's recognizing these, and it's not afraid. The work of Radical Dharma is not afraid. It's here to work on the relative plane, but it's recognizing these deep truths as we implement on the relative plane. And that combination, that, to go back to what Ashley said, that to me is how an enlightened society could actually arise, is through our actions being informed by our deepest knowing and understanding. So I would love to hear whether I've addressed that fully, Alex, or if you have any other thoughts, or Ashley, you might wish to jump back in since I referenced you many times too.
Well, I do have, oops, sorry, let's see, what did...
Yeah, no, yeah, Alex just said, great, yeah, I'll think about this, thank you. And I would love to have any kind of follow-up too.
Well, I think for me, and I also was just wondering how you work with this in an ongoing way through your actual meditation practice. So you just mentioned loving kindness, and I'm sure that obviously like any kind of compassion-based practices might help, or anything where we're getting more expansive in terms of, um, interdependence and those kinds of feelings that those types of practices generate. But I'm just wondering if you could speak a little more about, how it relates to practice and our ongoing personal practice.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that question because it gives me an opportunity to point to something that I find very important in practice, and that is, again, it's not that I have aversion to loving kindness practices at all. Because I trained in the Zen monastic tradition, they weren't actually part of my training, but we have, you mentioned we have this Peace in School semester-long mindfulness course out here in Portland, and part of our curriculum is loving kindness. So there's great benefit in that as a practice. And one of the things that practice can keep in place is that I am someone who needs to practice loving kindness, and through this practice, I'm going to have this other experience. It's just a really subtle way of implying that if we, that there's someone here that needs to do the efforting and then needs to take on this practice. What we're really talking about in this call is what happens when all of that efforting is released and our practice, if you will, and it's kind of a non-practice really. Like, think back to this image I gave of the fist just relaxing. You don't have to try to make the fist relax. The fist releases as we cease holding. So what happens when there can be the recognition that our being is shared, that our true nature is a shared nature. True nature doesn't belong to an individual ego. It's not a separate experience that we have. In the experience of enlightenment, for example, there is the recognition of the illusion that keeps the sense of separation in place. There's the falling away of it, and that experience of enlightenment is the revealing of true nature, the revealing of this inherently interconnected. And interconnected isn't even the right term because it implies that there are all these different objects that get connected. What I'm talking about now is this shared being that is inherently a field of connection. Therefore, if we were in touch with it, we would want our lives on the relative plane to be reflections of our direct experience of that shared being, of that. Again, interconnection is not the right word, but it's close. Do you know what I mean by that, Ashley?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. It also kind of raises a second question for me, and I promise this will be my last one because I've asked so many. But I also wonder. Well, I wonder about this too because of all of the work that you have done in the nonprofits that you've founded and with Peace in Schools too. I wonder how this comes into play in terms of the way that we help others. Like when we don't, if we approach kind of our volunteer work or the things that we're doing as separate, if we're separate, or I'm me and you're someone and I am helping you, and there's this sort of divide and hierarchy. I am the helper, you are the person I'm helping. I'm wondering if you could just talk a bit about how you approach that in terms of the work that you're doing and how this idea might apply to that.
Yeah, Ashley, I think you and me and Alex, like we're having we keep circling around the very same thing, which is what are these different pop-up ways that the mind of separation manifests? So one way the mind of separation manifests is I'm over here, so I'm this object, and you're this object, and now, well, let's say I'm this. Okay, so this is the ego. I'm over here. something or someone else is over here, and now I'm going to go relate to it. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to change it. I'm going to help it. I'm going to be a white savior, you know, whatever my conditioned thing is. That's still keeping in place separation in the mind. It's that the mind of separation is manifesting by perceiving the separation, and us doing action that's arising out of that perception keeps separation in place. I mean, how empowering is it for you when someone comes to you and says, oh, I really need to help you because I can see you need to be fixed. So there's all that dynamic that can come, even though the intention might be pure. What I'm suggesting in this call is that those actions really shift when those actions are arising out of the recognition that even though on the relative plane we appear separate, that's actually just, those appearances don't have to be seen as truly separate. So think of the way the mushrooms grow. You know, there are these like totally interconnected under the ground, and the mushrooms are apparently, you know, just the fruits. That this is all, or aspen trees, I'm told, are the same way, right? So they're actually all the same being popping up through the soil. What shifts when we're relating to each other with the recognition that we're the same being? Then it's like seeing that we're moved to respond from the love of something, from a love that is much larger than even this love that we think of as like, I love you, which can still keep separate objects in place. That's why I love that quote from Rumi. Rumi said, true lovers never meet. I think what Rumi meant by that is that they never really meet, because in the merging of love, the separation falls away. So these two lovers in the connection, in the union, they're not actually meeting anymore, because they're together in a different way than when they're not experiencing love and they're seeing each other as separate. Great. So I don't know if Alex, you want to chime in with anything else, since you've been part of this discussion, but you'd be welcome to type in anything else that you're present to.
I think he sent one more thing, which was, it's like threefold purity: no giver, no receiver.
Oh, great. I don't, that one's not appearing on my screen. Will you read it one more time? Oh, there it is.
Mm-hmm. It's like threefold purity.
Yeah, threefold purity: no giver and no receiver. Absolutely. What happens, again, in the spiritual bypassing thing that Alex made reference to, we're just going straight to like, oh, there's no giver, there's no receiver, and then there's this weird leap made that it's like, so therefore it doesn't really matter. But actually, in the realm of no giver, no receiver, there's because of this recognition of oneness, we in my experience, we care deeply. We without the giver and the receiver, all that's actually left is love. In the same way, without this story of I love you, if you release the I and you release the you, all that's left is love. And so what's happening on the relative plane, if we're moving through the world from that love, what's happening when, for example, maybe I'm teaching adults through Presence Collective, or maybe I'm in a classroom working with teens, and that work is arising out of the recognition that our very true nature is shared. How does that change things versus the energy of, as you were saying, Ashley, like, oh, I'm here to help people through teaching them about suffering. How does even this call change? How does this conversation change? How would this conversation be different if I thought, oh, I'm here to teach and to help people that need help? That would be a very different energy than a call where we would be sharing from the recognition that our being is the same being. And if you're on a call like this, then you care very much about an enlightened society or a world in which we are free to experience that fundamental and inherent liberation, versus caught in the veils of our conditioned perceptions, our conditioned tendency to see ourselves as separate from life, to see each other as separate, and in that world of separation, you know, that's where all the mechanisms of othering can thrive. All right. Yes, thank you. Thanks for saying thank you, Alex, and thank you to you. And Ashley, I'm happy to continue, and I recognize, I think we're just getting close to the time that you had mentioned. So you direct me, you let me know kind of if more things are coming up for you, or if you feel that it would be good for us to close.
We are at time, and so I do try to. We try to be mindful of your time and everyone's time. But this has been a really wonderful evening, and on behalf of our team and our subscribers, I just want to thank you so much for coming and teaching and offering yourself and your wisdom this evening. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Caverly.
Yeah, and thank you. And I just do want to recognize that if anyone watches this recording later, if anyone's part of this call now and wants to see more on this topic, I did do an online, it's a 3-class series through the Science and Non-Duality Conference, and you can access it through my website, caverlymorgan.org. And there's it goes much more deeply into this conversation over the course of 3 different sessions. And if anyone looks at it, and I think it's like $49 or something, but if anyone looks at it through this platform and is interested in it but doesn't want to pay that fee, just let us know. My assistant's name is Alyssa. You can just write alyssa@presencecollective.org or hello@presencecollective.org. I think gets to her as well, and we can sort out participation in that webinar if people are interested. And again, that website is caverlymorgan.org. So thank you.
We can actually put a link to that in the description for the recording, so that those who are watching the recording, you can just look in the talk description and click that link.
Perfect.
So
yeah.
Hopefully
Thank
by the
you.
time you're watching it, it'll be there.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate being here. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the end, but I'm glad it did end up working out. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, Ash.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thanks to all who joined us this evening. We have another talk next week. We've got our schedule all the way through the end of the year, so please do visit weeklydharmagathering.com, and you can also access this and other recordings of our recent talks on there as well for those who are watching later. So one last thank you to Caverly, and we'll see everyone next week.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.